Welcome to Stranger Stitches, where I set small fires in the dark corners of crime and history. I'm rated at least PG for language and content. Y'all know this is not a news story. I'm just an old lady sitting on the porch telling tales like folks do. So come on in, sit your fine ass down, and buckle up, Buttercup. Today we take a look into the New Orleans Casket Girls. My dear friend Brandy will be experiencing New Orleans for the first time, or we say Nolans. She's going this October, and I want her to love it as much as I do. Oh, and did I mention that this is her honeymoon? Yeah, she deserves all the happiness that life can throw at her, and I hope she catches every ounce. You've earned it, Brandy. Have a good time. Y'all, there ain't nothing quite as twisted as how a real history gets tangled up with a ghost story. Don't those make the best stories? Especially when you're talking about a bunch of young French women who got shipped off to the swamps of Louisiana with nothing but their virtue and a small chest of belongings. The Casket Girls of New Orleans, that name alone should tell you how this story's going to get sideways, represent one of the most fascinating examples of how real human suffering can morph into the supernatural legend. And I'm not here to tell you that part ain't true either. But it happens faster than you can say, laissez le bouton rouler, which is Cajun for let the good times roll. So let me step away from the supernatural for a skinny minute and talk about what happened here. Starting around 1704 and continuing through the 1720s, the French colonial government had themselves a big problem. New Orleans was basically a testosterone-fueled military outpost and a rough port city where the men outnumbered the women by more than 2 to 1. And these weren't exactly the kind of refined gentlemen you'd be bringing home to mama. We're talking about fur trappers, soldiers, sailors, dock workers, various other rough characters who were about as civilized as a pack of hogs. Being a port city meant that New Orleans attracted a constantly shifting population of transients, men who'd roll into town with a ship or a trading expedition, raise hell for a couple weeks, and then disappear back upriver or out into the wilderness. Now, sure, there were brothels and taverns aplenty to service the crowd, but what the colonial authorities really wanted were honest women, and I know you heard me roll my eyes. They wanted respectable wives who could civilize these rough characters, good luck with that, and bear them legitimate children. You know, I just got nothing to say. And help establish permanent families that would actually stick around and build a proper French colony instead of just another lawless frontier trading post. Well, the French authorities, in their infinite wisdom, decided the solution was to round up young women from orphanages, convents, charitable institutions back in France, and ship them across the Atlantic like mail-order brides. These weren't volunteers either. Mind you, these were girls, some as young as 12, who had about as much choice in the matter as the chicken does in being loaded onto a dinner plate. They got their name from the small chest, or casket, that they carried with their meager possessions, and over time it got Americanized to Casket, which would give you a pretty good idea where this story is headed. The journey itself was a nightmare that would make any horror movie director giddy. And packed below deck for months at a time, these young women arrived in the New World looking like death warmed over, pale as ghosts, gaunt from malnutrition, and probably traumatized beyond belief, because who all knows what happened on that ship? When they finally stumbled off those ships in Mobile and Biloxi and eventually onto New Orleans, they must have looked like something that crawled out of the grave. And then there was the Ursuline nuns and the birth of a legend. Here's where the story really gets interesting in ways that you can't take to Sunday school. The Casket Girls were housed at the Ursuline convent in New Orleans, where a group of brave nuns had set up to educate and convert them along with the locals. These nuns were doing the Lord's work. No doubt about it. But they were also sitting on what would become one of the most enduring supernatural legends in New Orleans history. The third floor of that convent, and this part is absolutely true, had its windows sealed shut and nailed close. Now, the practical reasons for this were probably pretty mundane: keeping the girls' belongings safe, making sure their virtue stayed intact, and maybe just keeping out the Louisiana humidity and mosquitoes. I also had another idea about this. Some of the girls who had had it rough already and knew what they were in for might have found it easier to take a leap out the window than jump the broom with somebody they didn't know. But that's just a thought out of my own head. In a city that was already bubbling the cauldron of African spiritual traditions, French Catholic mysticism, and general frontier weirdness, those sealed windows became something much more sinister in the popular imagination. Local folklore started whispering that those nails were blessed by the Pope himself, that something unholy was being kept locked away up there. Some of the Casket girls themselves were vampires and sleeping in their little chests by day and prowling the streets at night. Others claimed that actual vampires had smuggled themselves into the New World inside those innocent-looking cassettes, like some kind of supernatural Trojan horse operation. What's absolutely horrifyingly fascinating about this whole mess is how quickly historical trauma transformed into supernatural entertainment. These women were victims of a system that was treating them like breeding stock, torn from everything they knew and expected to marry complete strangers in a frontier settlement that was barely hanging on by its fingernails. Some of them fought back, too. There's documented evidence of what historians call the Petticoat Rebellion. Have you ever heard that? Every time a woman has a strong opinion about something, they call it a petticoat rebellion? Yeah, well, that's where the name came from. It was from the Casket girls. Well, basically what happened is they went on sex strike, refusing to sleep with their husbands until living conditions improved. This wasn't just individual acts of defiance. They were organized. It was resistance that spread through their community like wildfire. These women, who had been treated like property since the moment they were selected for shipment, discovered that withholding intimacy was one of the few weapons they had in their arsenal. The rebellion was particularly effective because the entire project depended on these women producing the next generation of French settlers. Without their cooperation, the whole demographic strategy of the Louisiana colony would collapse faster than a house of cards. The women's demands weren't unreasonable. They wanted proper housing instead of makeshift shelters, adequate food and supplies, basic medical care, and some semblance of safety. But the fact that they had to withhold their bodies to get these basic human necessities speak volumes of what little agency they were granted in this new world. And did I mention that when they were shipping these young ladies over here, they intentionally shipped a few more than was required at the time because they knew some of them wouldn't make it. So, yeah, we just throw a couple spares on there. But somewhere along the way, the real story of survival and resistance got buried under layers of vampire mythology and ghost tour theatrics. Now, I'm not saying that there is not an element of the supernatural in New Orleans, because I certainly believe there is. But it does get buried, the true stories do. They get buried under all the mythology when New Orleans has such a rich history. We need to get past some of that and dig a little deeper. Go to page 3 in the history book. So here's where it started. The pale complexion that came from months of malnutrition and confinement became evidence of their undead status. The sealed windows that probably protected their privacy became proof of supernatural containment. Their small traveling chests became coffins for the creatures of the night. We can't really talk about the Casket girls without acknowledging the unique cultural stew that was brewed up in New Orleans. This wasn't just French and Spanish colonial culture. You had enslaved Africans bringing their own spiritual traditions, Native American influence, and later waves of immigrants from all over creation. In that kind of environment, where reality was already pretty fluid and the line between the sacred and the profane was thin as tissue paper. It's no wonder that a group of traumatized young women with mysterious luggage would spawn centuries of speculation. The city's relationship with death in the afterlife was already complicated by practical concerns. You try burying bodies in a place that's below sea level and see how long they stay put. The soggy ground had a disturbing habit of giving up its dead during heavy rains and floods, with coffins floating to the surface and corpses washing through the streets like some kind of biblical plague. This led to the famous above-ground cemeteries that dot the landscape today, those cities of the dead, where bodies were entombed in marble crypts that look more like little miniature mansions than final resting places. You had enslaved Africans bringing complex and beautiful spiritual traditions, including beliefs about ancestors who remained active in the world of the living, spirits that could possess the living, and the thin, thin veil between life and death. You should go sometime to St. John's Bridge on St. John's Day. I think it's June 22nd, 23rd. It's a beautiful thing to see. So these practices merged and evolved with French Catholicism, Spanish colonial superstitions, and later influence from Haitian refugees fleeing their own country's revolutionary upheavals. Add in general frontier tendency to explain the unexplainable through supernatural means, because when you're living in a swamp where alligators outnumber people and yellow fever can wipe out half of your neighborhood in a summer, and you've got the perfect breeding ground for the vampire legends. Fast forward to today, and the Casket Girls have become a cornerstone of the New Orleans supernatural tourism industry. Ghost tours stop at the Ursuline convent to tell tales of the sealed windows and the vampire nuns. Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles didn't create the Casket Girl legend, but she sure amplified it and gave it a modern Gothic romance twist that made New Orleans synonymous with vampire culture worldwide. Now you've got vampire shops in the French Quarter, blood red cocktails named after undead creatures, and tour guides spinning tales that blend just enough historical fact with supernatural fiction to keep the cash registers ringing. The irony is thick enough to cut it with a knife. These women, who were exploited by one economic system, have now become the foundation for another. But did it ever benefit them? Not one skinny bit. They're real stories of hardships and resilience, overshadowed by tales of fangs and eternal life. The Casket Girl phenomenon, the real story, is actually more horrifying than any vampire tale you could dream up. These human beings who survived ocean crossings that killed their companions, adapted to a hostile environment that would have broken a lesser spirit, and somehow managed to build families and communities in one of the most challenging places on earth. The fact that their story of survival has been transformed into entertainment says something pretty uncomfortable about how we process historical trauma. It's easier to imagine these women as supernatural creatures than to confront the very human systems of exploitation that put them on those ships in the first place. The Casket Girls weren't vampires, but they were something arguably more remarkable. They were survivors who found ways to build lives and families in the wreckage. Their legacy isn't the sealed window of an old convent or vampire tours that stop at every shop. It's the bloodlines of Louisiana families who can trace their ancestry back to these brave women, and the reminder that behind every ghost story, there's usually a very human truth that's worth remembering. So the next time you're walking through the French Quarter and some tour guide starts spinning a tale about vampire nuns and coffin-carrying maidens, take a moment to think about the women behind the legend, the one who crossed the ocean with nothing but hope in a little box, and somehow they planted roots in swamplands that would become one of America's most unique cities. Now that's a story worth telling, fangs or no fangs.